What I'd like to do is welcome you all to the first CRADLE seminar that's streaming via YouTube. So you'll hear a few of us doing things that are perhaps a little bit tentative to start with, but we think we've got it completely under control, mainly due to the lovely Paige who's off screen and you can't see. I'm really doing very little in this session. I just get to chair, which means I introduce the panel host and do all that kind of official business. And we'll get started on the proper seminar in about a minute or so. So I'll commence with the sort of opening remarks. First of all, absolute welcome. Delighted to have you on board to this August CRADLE seminar. And we were really hoping that we would not be quite so locked down as we are in this point. But, you know, greetings to you all from St Kilda East, which is where I am at the minute, in Melbourne, in the middle of stage 4 lockdown. And we are pursuing at CRADLE a very strong agenda of continuing to try and do these sorts of activities and embracing, I think, some of the great opportunities from joining with you from all around the country. That you know, you've got to look at some silver linings that this situation has given us. So I'd like to start off by paying my respects to the traditional owners on the land on which I stand, which is the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I invite anyone who wishes in the YouTube channel, you may have to log in to comment, to note the traditional owners of the lands in which you are as well. So I'd like to begin by introducing the panel host. Associate Professor Phil Dawson is a fabulous colleague of mine, and he is also an absolute expert both in feedback and, I think, in the business of digital threat to academic integrity. So this sort of area here, this sort of intersection of the two, I think is a really interesting place for him. And I will give Phil's book a plug. Phil has a book coming up, and I'd invite you all to go and buy a copy. He wrote it all himself. If you follow Phil, you know he wrote a draft in about 60 days using a mixture of sheer determination and the Pomodoro technique. The book is called Defending Assessment Security in a Digital World, Preventing E-Cheating and Supporting Academic Integrity in Higher Education, and it will be published in November in 2020. And I'll give a plug for another book at the end of the seminar, but let Phil have this moment. So I would highly recommend it to you. I have read little bits and pieces of it and it's stunning. So having said that, I will throw to you, Phil, to take us through feedback and to introduce our panel.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And the check is in the mail for that wonderful plug for the book. Look, thanks to everyone for joining us. It is so exciting to have you here. When we were thinking in our CRADLE meeting, what should we have as our next seminar? We kicked around a few ideas. We chose feedback and online learning. We thought we'd get a usual turnout, which is good. You know, a few hundred people. But more than 500 people have registered for this seminar. And I think that's really strong endorsement for both our choice of seminar topic, feedback and online learning, but also that feedback remains an area that is in critical need of attention right now, more than ever, with the shift to emergency remote online learning and teaching that COVID made us all have to do. So thanks so much for coming along. First thing I want to say is the Twitter hashtag for this event is #CradleDeacon. It's the one we use for all of our seminars. So if you are able to do both the YouTube and the Twitter thing at once, like some people are able to do, then please jump on Twitter, tweet #CradleDeacon. So how today's going to work is we are streaming this on YouTube, as you know, and it's being recorded, so people in the future will be able to watch this. We have 3 presenters today, and each one's going to talk for 10 minutes maximum. And after that, after the 3 have all spoken, at the end, we're going to have a lot of time for questions, answers, discussion. Please keep that YouTube discussion going. I can see it's already going really well, and that's wonderful. We will monitor that as we go for some great questions, and we'll also look for questions at the end. I will pose questions to the panel. Margaret's going to be helping to monitor the YouTube chat as well. Please bear with us because this is our first time we've done a seminar like this on YouTube. So if stuff goes wrong or whatever, let us know. We will do our best to bounce back and figure it all out. So that's the procedural, boring introduction part. Now the really cool introduction part is for our 3 speakers today. You've probably read their bios, but they're famous experts in feedback and online learning, and we're really lucky to have them. So firstly, we're going to have Associate Professor Rola Ajawi from CRADLE talk. Rola's got such a depth of expertise around feedback and online learning, including getting dialogic feedback to work at a really big international scale for students located all around the world, and also reviewing the evidence on what happens when you switch media with feedback, what happens when you take what we do and chuck it online. Rola's also the Deputy Editor of Medical Education. We've also got Michael Henderson from Monash. Michael's done a ton of pioneering work on audio, video, screencast feedback. Michael's a professor and leader of the recent OLT Feedback for Learning project. That's feedbackforlearning.org. And he's also one of the lead editors on AJET, which is the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology. And he's also a dear collaborator and colleague of CRADLE. We've done a lot of stuff with him. And also today we have Michael Sankey, who's a professor and director of learning transformations at Griffith Uni. Michael S. is one of Australia's key leaders in online learning, one of the key experts, and he's also director of the Australasian Council of Open, Distance and E-Learning, ACODE, and he's got a great Zoom background as well, I reckon. So I'm going to keep the intros to that. I'm going to throw over to Rola now, and then I'll intersperse briefly to chuck to the next person and so on, and we'll chat in detail at the end. Thanks so much. Over to you, Rola.
Super. Thank you, Phil. I'll just share my screen with you. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be with you. I'd like to also start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land I'm meeting you on, who are the Woiwurrung people, and to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. So the topic for today, feedback in online learning, and I have a simple proposition for you in the next 10 minutes. And that is, for effective feedback in online environments, we require deliberate design. And this deliberate design should involve both relational scaffolding and cognitive scaffolding. And that's really the premise of my next 10 minutes. So as Phil mentioned, some of the work I'm going to be presenting today comes from a realist review of the literature, and it is as yet under review. So this is hot off the press. But just to start with, this is a bit about where these two kind of ideas come from is from this synthesis of 58 papers in undergraduate education looking at feedback outcomes specifically. So let's start with relational scaffolding, and this is very close to the work that I do. I'm really interested in issues around relationship, affective and motivational work. And the argument here is that feedback isn't just about knowledge and isn't just about work, but it actually has a really fundamental influence on motivation and on effort. And that's what we find in this review. And over half the papers we looked at did actually talk about how important it was for the students to feel that they are in a relationship with the educator, that they care for them, and this led to motivation to engage in feedback interventions that led to improved self-efficacy and evaluative judgment. Now, what you'll notice there is the plus or minus increased performance, and I'll get to that shortly, but that's because just improving motivation and effort doesn't necessarily need to improve performance. But importantly as well, when feedback interventions reduce students' perceptions of relatedness, i.e. that students felt that they weren't cared for, that no one really cared about their work, or they weren't interested in them, that could lead to avoidance or disengagement from feedback interventions and a loss of efficacy and feelings of hopelessness, in particular for students who perhaps haven't performed quite as well in the past. So where am I heading with this? This is what some of the literature looked like. Please don't feel the need to write any of this down. It's more to give you a flavor of the types of strategies that people were using that improved that notion of relationality. And unsurprising, dialogue was in there. It doesn't have to be face-to-face dialogue. There were a few studies that looked at the human versus the machine, and then that interesting idea of substituting what we do in written feedback with audio or video. So it's a media substitute there. It's still a one-way transmission of feedback, but through audio or video. And this has been a really big area of research in terms of technology and what technology can do. And this is where that caveat that Phil alluded to about a simple media switch, and where I mentioned about the plus or minus performance. Although students felt that they were being cared for, and we see that in their comments about the audio video feedback, in that sense of the human approach, the personal and conversational, or I could hear you smiling. They could hear the teacher who is giving them the feedback in the audio feedback. So there's that sense of a relationship and perhaps motivational efforts. But what we identify, in fact, in this paper here, and this research that was led by my colleagues Paige Mahoney and Susie McFarlane, is that it doesn't necessarily lead to big performance gains. The evidence is marginal. Although they were satisfied, they had felt a relational improvement and self-efficacy, it didn't always lead to improved performance. And so that led to the question of, is it enough to simulate that sense of a relationship, that sense of a dialogue through these one-way approaches using technology? Or do you actually need to do more than that for feedback to make a difference? And what I would say is actually what it really also needs to do, as well as the relational scaffolding, is it needs to do the cognitive scaffolding. And that is that feedback needs to be more than information transmission. And this is from the Realist review that that is still under review, and that is that feedback interventions that promote cognitive scaffolding. And what that's about is knowledge co-construction, collaborative work, and it doesn't have to be only with an educator. This could be through peer work. It motivates students to engage with feedback interventions, improve self-efficacy, but also performance and evaluative judgment. Now, this is where the bulk of the evidence, the papers that we looked at was, and what you see there is, again, don't worry about the detail, is more about the types of strategies that led to this cognitive scaffolding, whether it's through feedback loops because of formative tasks or nested sequence tasks, whether it was through action plans that forced some level of sense making, some element of reflection on the information, some processing, whether it was through dialogic feedback. And here you see the dialogue come into it again. And for anyone who knows my work, I'm really interested in this idea of dialogue and how it mediates both the relational and the cognitive side of learning. And the other bunch of papers was around feedback proformas and or reflective tasks. And what that looks like, it varied actually in different different studies. So for example, it could be interactive cover pages where students might self-assess their work against standards. It might be appending an explanation for the changes that they made as a result of previous feedback information that they received. So there's some form of engagement with the work, some sense making that is collaborative, that they could ask questions, that they could seek additional feedback to help in terms of that sense making. And this is what some of the studies say in relation to this point. So Esterhazy and Damser look at this iterative nature of tasks and the ability to document how students' work is changing, but also to help clarify intended meanings of feedback information. The idea of helping students articulate how they're using feedback in the next draft or the next submission is around helping students to efficiently organise and respond to instructor feedback, but also that issue of you could continue to improve, to put more effort in, but if the feedback language and that repertoire of language doesn't really make sense to you, if the standards are very ephemeral and elusive, then on its own, that's not enough. You need that cognitive scaffolding that comes through iteration, through processing, and through collaborative work with others. Now, I mentioned dialogue, and yes, in our study, it was face-to-face because it was mostly with undergrad, but this is another piece of work I've done with David Bowd, and this is the project where we developed a programmatic, I mean the course curriculum team at Dundee, when I was over at Dundee Uni, developed a programmatic feedback journal, and it had all these hallmarks of this cognitive scaffolding and the relational work as well. And you can look at the paper to have a look at how those things interplayed. But my point here, I raise this, is to show that it can be done online. It doesn't have to be synchronous, it can be asynchronous and over time. So that's really been my thesis, is that effective feedback, online feedback, requires deliberate design, and it needs attention paid to the relational scaffolding and cognitive scaffolding. And if you'll indulge me with just a couple more slides, it does necessitate, and I couldn't help but drop in some definitions because I do like a good definition. It does necessitate a reframing of feedback that is more than just information, that is about dynamic, co-constructive interaction in the context of a safe, mutually respectful relationship for the purpose of challenging a learner's thinking and for growth. And so hopefully that definition doesn't leave you looking like that young boy in the picture. And another definition, just to end on, is that notion of online learning. And yes, technology is an important mediator, but it is still an awkward term, and it's never fully virtual, because even though we're meeting in this way, for example, that's fully online, I'm still a person, we're still bodies that are interacting, that are making sense of this. And it's never purely face-to-face, because technology always mediates learning in one way or another, whether it's through the LMS, whether it's through audio, video, or through your mobile technology. And so online learning is about complex entanglements of a variety of things. And just to finish off, why I wanted to end on that slide is because I think future research in feedback in online environments actually needs to look at the ways in which these interpersonal relationships, how we can simulate them and make them happen for real in large classes, for example, and there is evidence to suggest that is possible, how we can build in that collaborative engagement in valued activity, and finally to look more closely at the ways that technology mediates that across multiple platforms, spaces and places. And I'll end there. Thank you, Phil, for letting me go that extra minute.
Thank you so much. I found that absolutely enthralling, and thank you also for being so bold as to pose a definition for feedback, which in our experiences, defining feedback can be a contentious thing. It can lead to some great arguments. So I actually haven't been looking at the YouTube chat just then, but I'm imagining there might be some arguments around definitions. Look, one thing I failed to mention before was that Associate Professor Rola Ajawi is also one of the editors on the impact of feedback in higher education, which is a great new book that really gets at some of what Rola was talking about, the sort of evidence of feedback having some effect. I'm going to, and this wasn't teed up, but I'm going to throw over now to Professor Michael Henderson, who is also one of the editors of that book, which he has in his hands, which was the result of a great sort of CRADLE, Monash, Unimelb collaboration with lots of international authors. So yeah, over to you, Michael. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks, Rola. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. It's a wonderful honour to be here. What I'd like to do is build on what Rola presented, but also maybe go off on a bit of a tangent as well. I completely agree with Rola's key thesis around the need for purposeful scaffolding, and there's a number of ways that we can approach that. So I think I'd like to revisit also the current context of in response to, say, the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen this rapid shift, and I think it's well worth to consider what that might mean for the kinds of experiences that students and educators are going through. And I think that there's sort of lost opportunities as well as risks in that. There's, I might actually do a screen share. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you should all be able to see that. Terribly informative slide. But I think there's going to be some lost opportunities and risks. Lost opportunities because there's this great focus on what does it mean to assess? What does it mean to provide content? What does it mean to engage and interact with our students online? And while for many of the people who are in this particular webinar and watching this, it may not be that brand new, because let's face it, we're a bit self-selecting by coming along and listening to this presentation. But we know for many of our colleagues, for many of our peers, and for many of the students, this is a wholly new experience, or certainly new in a large way. There's this great emphasis on transferring what is now and into this new environment. Along the way, though, I think there's a lost opportunity of rethinking how we can do it, and doing exactly what Rola was talking about in terms of scaffolding particularly the feedback experience. There's risks involved. There's risks in terms of, as the teachers who have got these well-honed abilities to look at the students in their classroom, in whatever level, and figure out how to elicit performance, how to understand whether their students are understanding what's going on. The students' strategies of being able to figure out what is quality and what is really being expected of them, and how to do this better. Those opportunities in the corridor of nudging each other and figuring out, is that what you think that they meant by, is this what the lecturer meant? All these kinds of little ways and little mechanisms, and the kinds of things that people have built up are starting to be lost. Well, there's a potential risk for it. And so this is the kind of thing I'm sort of interested in figuring out, what does it mean to build different sets of strategies, or to find new locations or new places to enjoy it. So we may possibly come into an impoverished environment if we don't carefully structure the feedback experience. Here's an example from a university, from an extract. So I'm doing a lot more work around large data sets. And you can see that in this instance, whether it's for comedic factor or not, someone wrote in, "I fell asleep in the middle of your essay." Not the most useful, constructive, feed forward, any which way you want to look at it. It's not perhaps the best kind of feedback that we would certainly put up as an exemplar. I'm not suggesting this is how it always is, and indeed this actually predates COVID. Nevertheless, in an online environment, we need to think about the fact that we can't get the humor of that statement. We can't really interpret the relationship that's going on. Things are getting lost, and we need to find new ways to explore them. Certainly, we often want to provide rich comments if we think about the provision of whoever the provider is. And we think, well, how can we do it? And so this is obviously leading on to a long tradition of work that I've been engaged in along with fantastic colleagues. So those of you who are interested in learning how to do something, if you want particular strategies or steps or, step 1, step 2, etc., there's a great website, go to it. But along the way, and Rolla talked about some of the work that Paige here has written about, and in terms of an analysis of video feedback. Along the way, what we've found is that, yeah, there are a lot of positive components to it, but in all of my work, we've always ended up with this conclusion that while we can see so many different positive self-reported elements to it, and also we can sort of intuit, well, the educators are sort of reporting on observed changes in behaviour of their students, what we really are thinking is there is something about all those extra layers of design of an assessment and feedback sequence that really needs to be taken into account. And so it really becomes an issue for me then, thinking as we move online, that not only does the richness of the media, such as through video and screencasts, etc., which I believe have got something powerful in them, but in addition to that, we need to be thinking about how to help the sense making of our students by designing and front loading. One of the things, if we think about it, is that, when I do a lot of work with educators, one of the worries I have is all these extra layers of richness that are coming after submission. And I'd say, well, stop thinking about after submission, after that summative submission of your students' work, think about before submission. And so I'm now interested a lot more about the different interesting strategies that we can build feedback loops prior to that summative main assessment, including peer and self, system orientated. So, there's a big drive at the moment around learning analytics and the way in which we can use systems to prompt and guide both the educator and the students in their engagement with that kind of work. So really, I'm happy to talk about those kinds of designs. But one of the interesting ones is really thinking about a structure, a sequence of things. It's not just one event. So building an exemplars, students marking those exemplars of work, the teacher marking the marking of the students' exemplars, and these kinds of processes which build upon each other, leading up to that final summative assessment, after which the feedback content that a teacher might provide might be quite minimal because you're front loading a lot of that labor. So that's addressing the sustainability issue that often comes up in this space. I think I'll leave it there. So I've opened up a few different topics. Phil?
Cool. Thank you so much, Michael. I love your deep connection with both the realities of how this works and the deeper theory on how it works. Yes, I always enjoy listening to you talk about this. We're going to shift now from the sort of more feedback and long experience of feedback that we've had over to more of a sector-wide focus on, what we've learned from the rapid shift we've made to exams. And it's kind of hard to have a conversation about assessment and feedback without also thinking about this dominant mode of assessment that's out there, that is the exam, that we've had to rapidly shift online. So it's really great to have you here, Professor Michael Sankey, to talk with us about that. So over to you.
That's a pleasure, Phil. So really what I'm talking about is feedback of a different nature. I'm talking about feedback that institutions have given us on this process of running e-exams, e-exams over the last few weeks. So we do find that over the last, this last semester for you, that we've all shifted very quickly to being online. And so we found that across every university in Australia and New Zealand, and also one in the South Pacific, the University of, no, I better not say which one it was, we had 47 institutions, 47 universities participate in this survey that was sponsored by ACODE and Cordit. And we found that 24 institutions actually used a proctoring solution for their final exams. That meant almost half the institutions didn't use some form of proctoring solution, which is really interesting, given we all say that, oh no, we've got to use because of professional accreditation, we've got to do all these proctoring, we've got to have a supervised exam and things like that. But yet half the institutions in Australia didn't go that route. And so 23 institutions chose an alternate means. And they ran other forms of alternative assessments. They ran online open book exams and things like that, rather than a traditional proctored exam, whether it be using a proctoring solution. But there was a lot of stuff that went before this. Over the last few months, we'd had a heck of a lot of PR around the notion that students were completely alarmed by this thought of being monitored online. In fact, to not put too fine a point on it, they were shit scared of being actually seen by other people in different countries and being watched while they're doing exams. And so, and when I say other countries, most of the solutions are based in the US. And so we've got these foreigners kind of examining us, and the data, who knows what happens to that data from that. And so, and then you find the other day that some data from Proctoru was hacked. And this sent a new wave of shockwaves through the industry. Fortunately, we kind of found out there was old data, but still, we found that it was data being shared, and here's the hack site where you can purchase the data, or get the data for free now, but that goes up to, up to 2017. Well, Griffith, where I work, there were some students doing some online exams through Proctoru in 2017. We don't know if their data's out there. We hope not. We haven't been able to find that out yet. But so, it's a real fear. It's not just a fear associated with online proctoring solutions. Of course, other systems get hacked as well, and data gets shared and things like that. So what were the proctoring tools that we used? So institutions told us that 7 institutions were using Proctoru. So out of the 28 institutions that were using some form of software other than the LMS, so we saw of that 24 were traditionally proctoring solutions. So there's the 24 is, and you've got 28, there's some institutions there that use solutions but weren't proctoring solutions, but they were tools. So ExamSoft does some proctoring, but it wasn't always used to do proctoring. Similarly, Respondus is a lockdown browser as such and doesn't do proctoring, but versions of it do. So we see that Proctoru, and you see there that Zoom used 6 times to do proctored exams. That is, smaller exams where Zoom, like we have here, and the tutors monitoring the student while they're doing their activity. So it's a more homegrown solution, as it were. And so we also then look at some of the other solutions that were being used over this last couple of months. And we see there are non-proctoring solutions there, and Turnitin, of course, being one of those tools that were used primarily for the plagiarism checking of open form questions, open book exams, things like that. So probably the most used tool of all in terms of on the end of term exams was this Turnitin. So interesting findings there. And so we find, and my mouse isn't working. Yep. Okay. Out of those 18, 61% of those institutions were using Turnitin. So they were mostly through that open book type exam and assignments, of course, for final assessment. So overall, the use of the software that institutions use, not surprisingly, the LMS and the quizzes and things like that housed most of these assessments, whether it be Blackboard, Moodle, whatever it might be, Canvas. It's fairly consistent with the breakup of the learning management systems across the sector. And of course, all those other tools you saw over the last couple of slides. Now, we asked our institutions for some feedback as to whether they're happy with the solutions. So some institutions use more than one solution, so that's why the number adds up to more than the N. but 13 institutions were pretty happy with their existing solution, but 37 of those said no. The solutions we put in place for semester one didn't really make the grade for us, and so we will be looking at some other solutions in the future, remembering we all did this pretty quickly. And so there were some issues identified because of this, and that was, some of it was to do with service delivery, the capacity of systems to be able to cope with so many students doing things at one time, and also the ability for support staff to be able to come in and help out in a given service. So some of those were technical issues, some of those were service performance issues associated with the platform itself. And in many cases, it was the first time a lot of these institutions have been doing this. And so there were a range of factors, not just around the support side, but also around policy, for example. What university had policy around this? Why would we have, where do we stand in relation to the fact that students are concerned about the fact that somebody in another country is watching them? What is our policy on this? Where do we sit? And so there are a whole range of different issues we've had to come to terms with very quickly and put quick solutions in place. And of course, it comes down to the individual goals and ethos of each institution. And we find there were some institutions that took a particular stance and said, no, we are not going to use invigilated software. And to their credit, they saw that through and negotiated with the professional bodies. Now, it makes me wonder if one institution can negotiate a solution with a professional body and yet others are saying, well, no, my professional body will not accept the fact that we're not doing an invigilated exam. How does that fit? I mean, surely there's a point within the sector that we can come together and lobby with the professional bodies for that. Now, there could be a different range of solutions for that. Some of the alternate forms of feedback we saw for those formal assessments were things like time quizzes, just a simple time quiz within the LMS based on random quizzes and quiz banks of questions. Some work that we do here at Griffith is in relation to interactive oral assessments, where it's more around a conversation rather than the traditional vivosi or the oral exam, as it were. And so, and yet we saw a number of institutions use that. So, for example, those who are using Zoom and some others who are using Blackboard Collaborate were doing more the oral exam and things like that, which is fantastic. I love oral in the online space. And a lot of institutions, of course, were doing open book exams. That's just one resource out of the University of Newcastle I think is particularly good in relation to open book exams. Some things to consider. So some of the things that institutions learned over this time was that not everybody is comfortable with taking an online exam, and if we put the same time limits on people as we traditionally put on them, then that increases. There's a learning curve that is associated with using an online proctoring service as opposed to just coming into a lecture room or an examination hall and sitting down and with a pen and paper. There's considerations about not being quite so rigid in terms of our completion times. And of course, in the online environment, it gives us a bit more flexibility in relation to that. If you've, particularly when people are working at home and they've got children and sharing spaces with families and things like that. We saw a lot of that on the proctoring solutions that Griffith actually employed. We need to possibly be a bit more flexible with our deadlines and things like that. There's also feed forward mechanisms that we could employ a bit more often in relation to the exams and the reflection on the assessments that happen after the fact, getting students to reflect on that process and the answers they gave to exams and things like that. And of course, there's always the cheating behaviours that happen and potentially happen even within proctoring solutions. So we employed 2 proctoring solutions at Griffith. We employed Proctoru Live Plus and Proctoru Record Plus, which is simply recording the students as opposed to having a live proctor there. We saw within the Live Plus, there was potentially a 1% of cheating, but in the Record Plus, potentially we could say there was probably 8% of cheating, possibly. There's evidence to suggest that that was the case as we review the recordings and things like that. So there's that's not ideal. And how do we justify that further on? The paper I'm referring to, you can access from the ACODE website. And if you go to acode.edu.au, you can go to resources and then click on white papers and you'll see the white paper there. if you would like to download it and have a bit of a read to get the fuller data. And I think I'm open to questions after that. Thanks, Phil.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael S. It's great to get that view of across the sector what actually happened in high stakes assessment, because it has a big impact on feedback as well. I'm going to jump in with first question because I just get to do that because I've got the floor and microphone and whatnot. So Michael Sankey mentioned Vivas as something that might be happening. And I've always loved the idea of Vivas as a piece of dialogic feedback that we can build into what is often a high stakes summative assessment. And I've seen some conversations around using them really for the purposes of stopping cheating. So I'm wondering if perhaps, actually I'll throw this one to Roller. Do you think we might lose anything in Aviva if we're really doing it to stop cheating?
So I think there's always that tension around summative and formative, right? So if you're doing a Viva as a summative exam so that the students can actually talk through their work, presumably. Yeah, that's interesting. So I hadn't thought about it in relation to feedback and the feedback conversation. Potentially, if you had people pull together a portfolio in prep for a Viva, for example, that they might be able to then, after the Viva, perhaps make some revisions to or append some form of extra piece that is a reflection on the Viva and the conversation that happened, and then what they've learned as a result, or how they might change their or an opportunity to change that piece of work. That could potentially work. I mean, in clinical supervision, we use that kind of Viva in very much you observe something and you have a conversation about it. But to be honest, whenever it's under summative, the auspices of summative, it does end up being a bit tokenistic, and it ends up being about, you don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want to disclose things when you're in that summative environment. And so I think that could be a real challenge for having a real open feedback conversation.
So can I just say that there's some differences between an open conversation and Aviva. So Aviva is more the notion that there's a question posed by the lecturer, as it would be on the paper, and the student has to answer that question, as opposed to the conversation. So where the lecturer can tease out in a conversation, the Aviva is more, to my understanding, the same as a formal exam. It's where the lecturer poses the question as they would in the exam paper, student answers the question. The benefit, I suppose, is that the student can't cut and paste. They can't go searching Google for the answer. They have to answer the question as best they can, with the knowledge that's in their head, as they would through a written exam. It's more stressful than a written exam in many ways, and so we need to take those things into consideration as well. The other one where I mentioned was the more interactive and oral conversation. The interesting thing about Vivas is it takes, if you're doing a traditional online exam where you've got your part A and part B, where you've got your multiple choice questions and then your long form questions, it becomes more a case of the time it takes to ask the question to get that response. And in many cases, it can be more time effective to do the Viva than it can be to sit there and to mark an exam. So there's potentially time saving for the lecturer as well for a well-constructed Viva, as it is for that interactive conversation as well.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to see how the term means different things in the different contexts. There's a bit of a theme coming up in the chat around scale. And Michael Henderson, I know that in the Feedback for Learning project, scale was something that came up again and again and again. I don't want to just ask you a blunt thing. talk about scale, but that's what I'm going to do. Talk about scale.
So I think we're crossing, fantastic. No worries, I can answer that one easy. But just I suppose to be clear, I'm going to focus on feedback as opposed to talking about assessment at scale. And I think this conversation has moved backwards and forwards between assessment and feedback. And it's sort of natural to do so, really, because they're so intimately connected. But when we think about feedback as some sort of process by which students can figure out how they're tracking and what they can do next to improve their work. If we take that as a very broad definition, there you go, Roll, if there's an extra one. Then how do we do that at scale? Well, actually, the way I've just described it didn't even refer to the teacher. So often when we think as teachers and think about the process of feedback, we often put ourselves at the central position. And sure, we have got a central role. You know, we're structuring the course. We are working our hearts out to try and make this a meaningful experience. But we're not necessarily always going to be the people that write the feedback or record the feedback or generate it in other kinds of ways. So really, if once we've got that in our mind, then there's a whole heap of doors that open up to us in terms of how we might do this at scale. And of course, one of those options might be peer feedback or different ways to scaffold students into a form of self-feedback. And of course, these aren't the silicon bullets. They aren't going to fix everything. They're not going to be the best idea every time, each time. But we can do it at scale. There's other ways that we can help with scale, and that's by using, say, learning analytics and other kinds of mechanisms to help signal to ourselves as educators and to our students that certain kinds of processes are being engaged with, certain kinds of behaviors are occurring that might suggest a different way of thinking or a different way of working. In my own kind of work around video, audio, and screencast feedback, I always get the question about scale. How can you do this when you're teaching 1,000 students? Well, first of all, I haven't yet met a lecturer who teaches 1,000 students. You might lecture to 1,000 students, but then you might have 20 or so tutors who are working with those thousands of students. But you know, I don't work in every single university in the world, so maybe there are those instances out there. So really, what I'd be saying with that is there are a lot of examples of how you can do audio, video, screencast, audio visual kind of feedback at scale. And I have found it to actually be faster than doing it, in a careful text-based format. Yep. I can do it, richer. There's more detail. It's more personalized. It makes those connections. I can explain myself with the rich cues, which fits a whole heap of those problems and risks that I was talking about in terms of an impoverished environment. But it, of course, doesn't fix the overall structure of your assessment and feedback sequencing, which we were talking about before.
So it was also the in-context feedback that happens at the time. So you ask a student a question, they give you an answer that may not be quite right. You actually get the opportunity to feedback straight away and create that into a learning situation rather than just you naughty student, you got the wrong answer. So it's that positive aspect of that as well, where you can actually feed back into the student.
Yeah, Dylan William has this great line which goes something like, feedback should be more work for the recipient than it is for the donor. And I think, some of the sort of workloady stuff Michael H was talking about before sort of alludes to that as well, although we might not like the words recipient and donor if we go with a definition like what Roller posed to us before. Look, another thing that's sort of also about scaling of practice and whatever, there's been a question from Robin Ussel about sort of doing Vivas as spot checks. So you might call upon a random 10% of students and ask for some sort of Viva to confirm that they know the stuff. I've been in a few conversations where this has been contentious. There's been people on both sides arguing it's unfair or it's the only way we can get this to happen given our resources. I'm interested if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I just put that down to poor design in the first place. So if you have to do that, there's poor design in the first place. So if the question is designed in such a way that you can cheat, then there's a propensity for students to cheat. So if the question is through Vivas, I mean, it's either To me, it's either or. You can do the written exam in the online space where you've got the potential for cheating, then you've got to spend the extra time to check it and then go through that process with the student. Whereas if you employ that Viva to start with, you're basically saving time both in terms of running that exam and also in terms of the time it takes you to do the feedback.
So sorry, I'm juggling windows right now. It's that challenging one. But yeah, I think design is key. I don't know, to me, the jury's out on the extent to which we can completely design out cheating. We probably can't, but we can certainly do a lot of things to prevent it, to make it more difficult, and to see if it's happened. There's a question here for you, Michael Sankey, that I've got, which is from David Bowd. He wants to know, how were universities that did not use invigilated exams able to convince professional bodies to accept them as an alternative?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I mean, in our case, our heads of program approached professional bodies asking for some dispensation at that time, and were granted that dispensation. And according to the feedback we received, a number of other institutions did that, and actually probably did it more than we did, because we ended up having to run some exams. But in most cases, the professional bodies were quite accommodating, and it's just a matter of time. It means somebody has to actually do it, instead of just sit back on there and say, no, my professional association won't allow that, I'm sorry. Well, that's just not good enough. I mean, they do allow it. We've got proof that they've done it. And, there's every opportunity for institutions to make those advances to those professional bodies. The question is, why can't there be a body, whether it comes out of Universities Australia or whatever, that actually mediates that for us, so every institution doesn't have to go and do the same thing every time?
I've seen the comment in the chat, never waste a pandemic. And, I'm sort of wondering, how do we make the best out of this terrible situation that we're in? What are the things that we change in the long term with feedback as a result of the shift that we've had to do online?
It's an open question, is it, Phil?
Yeah.
I think one of it's horrible to talk about don't wasting the pandemic and everything like that. And but nevertheless, one of the positives out of this experience being dragged on for so long, or certainly in our part of Australia and our part of the world, means that people are not able to just think of this as a blink in the moment, and we had to do this painful thing of moving online, or suddenly trying to build relationships with students who we don't get to see in our classrooms and those kind of things, and sort of, that happened for 3 or 4 months and we can forget about it. Because this is dragging on, it's sort of becoming more of a reality. And also it's one of those things of building strategies and skills and recognizing that we have to make connection. And I think fundamentally, feedback works when you've made a connection, when you know your students and the students know you, and same with the teaching and same with the assessment. And so building up those series of skills that helps us to make those connections and understand each other. So and we could talk about a lot of other opportunities in terms of feedback, but fundamentally, I think the length of this experience and facing that reality is possibly one of the biggest things.
Yeah, I agree with you. Couldn't agree with you more, Michael. I mean, from where I'm sitting, full-time research, for me, it's the affordances of really now thinking about how do we create this connectedness? How do we mediate that relationship through technology in ways that are authentic, that kind of connect to all our diverse students wherever they are, wherever they're placed and however they're accessing this. And maybe, hopefully once the initial shock of the shifting everything online kind of moves on, maybe now is the opportunity to rethink the design that puts the online or the networked first, rather than what we do in face-to-face, and then just replicating that in the online environment, because that doesn't really work. So that would be the plug that I would go for.
Yes, I mean, this crisis has had a number of hidden benefits. So at Griffith, we've trained over 1,000 staff, unique staff, over, through literally hundreds of PD sessions over the last 6 months, over the last 5 months. 1,000 staff have attended training in terms of teaching online and things like that. It's been a massive human capital effort to actually bring a whole range of staff up to speed pretty quickly. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But at the end of the day, we got the second highest student satisfaction rating we've ever had on our trimester 1 courses. Now, it's because students knew that our staff were actually making an effort to compensate for the difficulties we're all going through. So there's been some huge lessons learned. I mean, we've raised the staff's professional development level. We did lots of workshops around online assessment, creating different forms of assessment, things like that. Opportunities that these staff would have never have had if we hadn't had a crisis on our hands.
I think that's a really great point. And we do need to sort of stop and appreciate the labours of the students, the educators, the educational designers, the technical staff, everybody who's involved in teaching and learning, because we have just been through a hell of a thing, and it's going to go on. And what we might do now is just do the formal close for 3 p.m, but then we stick around for another 15 minutes where we can still do more Q&A. But if you've got to run off to another meeting or whatever, it's not awkward at all to leave at the 3 p.m. close. So I'm just going to formally thank Rola, Michael and Michael for fantastic presentations and really great engagement in those questions. Thank you so much. And I'm doing the awkward single person clapping thing, but I just realized there's no one else to raise their hand in this thing. But yeah, thanks so much. We might shift modes a little bit. Are there any questions on the stream that any of you have spotted that you'd like to sort of engage with now in words? Because I've spotted some of you presenters on there.
Phil, I've got a question for the panel, because it strikes me that as we moved into this pandemic time and everyone, from the school sector, universities, professional contexts, are shifting this idea of, gee whiz, we've got to do this online. There's been this proliferation of best practice and tips and tricks and strategies, to the point that it's almost impossible now to find something that you might be really trying to find, or to decide to discern what is something that it's got a great empirical basis, or is well proven. It's really hard to find stuff. So on one hand, it's been this fantastic boon to our field, and on the other hand, it's sort of this, oh no, everyone be quiet. We need to find the few voices to really follow. So I was just wondering what the strategies are, or suggestions, or maybe there's similar complaints as myself.
I'd say similar complaint from this end. I mean, I've seen a lot of sites in the last 3 months that are absolute crap. I mean, they really are. The stuff that they're propagating out there is just absolute nonsense. I mean, things I would never put on our own website. So, yeah, there is so much stuff out there, but it's buyer beware. I mean, in a talk I've done a few times is link up with those people in the professional associations are solid in this area. So link up with the people in CRADLE. Link up with those people who have research centres around assessment. Don't just link up to the University of XXX because they've put up a page about authentic assessment. Go with those professional networks you have and have established over a period of time for the solid information.
Yeah, I'd say read the CRADLE stuff. No, seriously though. I mean, some of it's trial and error too, right? So some of it is a bit around talking to people in the institution or other people who know through the association. But some of it is the courage to actually do the design and see what happens, in terms of how it connects with your students, and then to actually really monitor that effect and talk to the students about what's working and what's not in your unit, in the design, in the teaching, and that I think makes a difference.
I have really mixed feelings about the question that Michael H. posed. On the one hand, I am someone who definitely wants to propagate the use of whatever the best evidence you can get is. And then on the other hand, within my field of assessment security and cheating and whatever, we could end up in kind of evidence paralysis because we don't have evidence on lots of stuff. I get asked a lot of questions for which I only have hunches, and I've read as much as I can read, and all I can give is these hunches. And I've even got, I'll tell my ghost story, which is I've approached several remote proctoring vendors asking them to let me do a study where I try to cheat with their tools. And all of them have said, no, that's against our terms of service. You explicitly may not do that. So there's some questions I may never have an answer to, regardless of how hard I try. Mm-hmm. So I think we're in that difficult position where we needed to make some rapid shifts. But I agree, we need to keep the quality bar high as it can kind of be.
I think they're all fantastic. I love rollers as well. The idea of just get on and do, but look out for the impact, which feeds nicely back to our book, that impact of feedback.
Yeah, I mean, even in those crap sites, there are some interesting things that could be picked up on and said, oh, okay, maybe we could actually turn that into some research and make, to test that out. So there are glimmers of hope out there as well.
There is another question coming through, and this one sort of comes a little bit on the back of what you were saying, Phil, before, I think it was from Shirley Ma, saying that I would love to have the panel comment on the free offers from EdTech companies and the possible institutional risks.
Ooh.
I suppose that the short answer to that is there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's always something in there, and the other aspect of it is teaching, learning, assessment, feedback, the whole works. It's a designed endeavor. So any product or system or process that you buy into is a designed thing. And really you need to understand the alignment between that design and your own goals. And those are the obvious answers, of course. And Michael, I suspect you've come across this question quite often with your work.
I couldn't tell you how many times I've been approached by vendors in the last 6 months to sell us stuff that's going to help us. And it comes, as you say, it comes back to design. I mean, every day it comes back to design and being confident in the systems and processes that you have. So at any one time, Griffith has like 15,000 students who are studying an online course. So, we've honed that a bit over the years. So we know we've got the systems. But, something glossy will come along and you think, oh, wow, that looks nice. But sometimes you just got to stay the course and go with what you know. Because if you start at these times, if you start introducing new things on top of all the new things that they're having to learn, that is just a recipe for disaster.
I suppose to put a counterpoint to it is I've talked to quite a few of the CEOs and other kinds of people who are at the very core of some of these enterprises. And I think deep down they are focused on the idea of improving the teaching, the learning, the outcomes. And so I'm always very cautious of vilifying enterprise or these kinds of endeavors. But at the same time, it's just that balanced approach.
Absolutely. That's not to say the tools are crap or anything. It's just saying, just give us a sec. Look, we're right in the middle of this disaster. Come back to me in 3 months, 6 months, when we've got a bit more headspace to kind of deal with this, because you don't want to be changing quickly on people. That's the last thing our staff need. Our academic staff need to know that there's a consistent line being held for a while instead of introducing new stuff on top of them.
Yeah, I would have to say that the tools are just so influential. So any engagement that we can have in steering what those tools do can be great. I remember a project Margaret and I did along with several other colleagues. And in our data set, one university had a drop-down box that you had to choose the assessment task type from.
Yep.
And people tended to do the task types that were in the drop-down box. So really minor things in the hands of someone who's not necessarily an educational designer can have quite large impacts.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it comes back to the image I have in my background. I mean, that image is the technology cart being pushed by the pedagogy horse. I mean, it doesn't work that way. The pedagogy has to lead the technology. And if we're going from a tool-based approach first, that doesn't work. We've got to know our pedagogy. We know why we're doing things, and we have a list of things that we can actually do those things with. That's the only way I can take it forward.
Can I add something else into the mix in terms of those systems, which is our admin systems? I think they're really prohibitive to doing a lot of things. And I think that if we're going to rethink some things, I'd like to suggest that might also be another piece of the cart there.
Yeah. You're certainly not, you're talking to the converted here, I think. Absolutely.
Now, we've got a little bit of a plug going on here for a book, which is Reimagining University Assessment in a Digital World. You know, we don't want to turn this into a total book plug fest, but please do check out that book. There's a link to it in the stream there. And there's been an attempt to share a discount voucher as well, which will provide a certain amount off that book. Because Margaret, I know a lot of these challenges are things that were sort of swirling around in our heads when we were talking about that book.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we came to in that book is actually reimagining is really hard. It is so easy to say, but it's actually really difficult. And while there are some great examples and so forth in there, I think one of the things I really took away from working on that piece is that that we shouldn't underestimate the amount of challenge ahead of us when we try and change practice in a fundamental way. That feels like a very low note. There's wonderful things you can do. It can be super exciting, lots of ideas, but I do think that we need to go, and I think this comes to the point about the admin. I do think we need to, it's a whole of university endeavour. It's not just one piece. It's not just the pedagogy. It's not just the technology. It's everything has to go lockstep together.
Yep.
It depends what level you're at. So if you're working at a unit of study level or within a course, I mean, you can start at that level and really affect change and do some really interesting things, such as introducing nested tasks that sequence against each other in relation to learning outcomes, and just the bread and butter of getting those things right and using technology in ways that enable connection, in ways that support you achieving your goals. So, you know, when we did the feedback journal across the whole program, and I totally get what you're saying there, Margaret, because it was like, well, our LMS doesn't do that. It's like, well, okay, so what we want is this journal that the feedback can be collected in, this conversation about the feedback and reflection about it can happen, that could then lead into a capstone project. And there was a lot of toing and froing with IT, and but we kind of did a workaround using this wiki, and so I agree with you completely, but I think if we don't try, then
Absolutely.
we're not going to get there. So that's a more positive
with
note to
you.
end on.
Absolutely. And people have tried and they've achieved, just like you did in that unit.
Sometimes you don't.
Look, I think that might be...
That's the thing. It's okay to fail, right, Michael?
Absolutely. I clearly failed.
Oh, gosh. We were talking about who did the most dad jokes, you or me, Michael Henderson, and they were telling me that I did, and bang. I think that's a good.
Yeah, but you're winning on the lockdown look. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll get you to sign that on a piece of paper later. That's a good spot for us to end, I think. So I'll throw over to Margaret Niman, who will wind things up.
That's just really, I don't think to wind anything up, just to thank everyone. Fabulous to have everyone on the panel. Just a really interesting conversation in this moment in time, and also everyone on the YouTube channel. Really interesting conversations running parallel, and this is something I love about this mode, is how
absolutely amazing who's been online.
Yeah, absolutely. And such interesting thoughts. So if you haven't been keeping account of it, go back and have a look. It's worth a view. So thank you to you all. Stimulated my mind, and we'll talk to you soon.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.